Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tank. My name is Alan. The lightsaber is like no other weapon in the Star Wars galaxy. This pure rod of colorful energy can be seen from many miles away in perfect conditions. The thrumming sound of the plasma is like no other sound known to man. And in the hands of a true professional who can twirl and fling the saber around like it's a spinning blade, the sight of a lightsaber can be either mesmerizing and create a sense of peace and tranquility, or it could bring a sense of pure chaos and destruction, depending mainly on what color that blade is. But as all Star Wars fans know, lightsabers are not a weapon for everyone. It takes great care, training, and practice, along with a good amount of natural ability to successfully wield one of these blades. Now, many non-force sensitives or borderline force sensitives have wielded lightsabers throughout the ages, and many have hurt themselves or gotten hurt because of their lack of ability to use this difficult weapon. Only someone with a strong connection with the Force can truly master the lightsaber, and a lot of that has to do with the weightlessness of the blade and the kyber crystal, which actually channels the user's energy and intent into the actual plasma blade itself. These weapons also imprinted through the Force to their users. And so, to a non-Force user, these things can be quite mysterious and intimidating. But counter to popular belief, the lightsaber is not like the ultimate weapon. Heck, it's not even the ultimate melee weapon in Star Wars. No, the lightsabers, just like the Jedi, have limitations. Self-imposed limitations, which actually makes this weapon less than ideal in certain combat situations. And Anakin Skywalker, being the combat-focused youth he was, quickly picked up on this quality of the lightsaber. During one sparring session between Anakin and Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Padawan asks his master the question, why don't the Jedi have cooler and more devastating equipment? Obi-Wan Kenobi's answer is quite surprising. You see, when he was a young Padawan, he came up with this idea of essentially lightsaber nunchucks, which Anakin, of course, immediately was excited about. He probably thought to himself, my master might not be that boring after all. But of course, Obi-Wan Kenobi's master, Qui-Gon Jinn, had other thoughts about lightsaber nunchucks, and he would teach Obi-Wan a lesson that Obi-Wan would turn around and teach Anakin. We do not want to be powerful. We wish to stand tall against the dark. Our tools reflect that goal, especially our chosen weapon. We all wielded the same one with minor variations, the lightsaber. We could make kyber bombs or blasters. Indeed, it's been tried. There are a few weapons like that in the sealed archives. But anyone can fire a blaster, very few can safely and skillfully wield a lightsaber. Everyone in the galaxy knows this to be true. We want our opponents to know that we use a weapon that requires intention, training, precision, and choice. The lightsaber symbolizes the care with which we approach our gifts through the Force and the care with which we wield them. It reminds others that while we could do more, we very purposely do not. Take it, my Padawan. We choose a weapon with limitations, with difficulties. You cannot use a lightsaber to destroy a city or a planet. Every death or injury it inflicts must be precisely chosen. The lightsaber tells the galaxy that the Jedi are not destroyers, we are protectors. And Kenobi speaks the truth. The lightsaber is purpose-built not to be the most efficient weapon out there. It's built instead to perfectly fit the Jedi Order's purpose and ideology. The Jedi feared the power of their members greatly. This is why a lot of their traditions, a lot of their rules are all focused on limiting the power of an individual Force user. The lightsaber is an important part of that philosophy. For instance, at a very intimate connection with the user, as we spoke about. Every slash, every maiming or killing is something a Jedi can sense and feel through the Force. And that's exactly how the Jedi set this up. They wanted everyone to think carefully before taking life. That's because taking life is a serious decision. In the past, the Jedi have developed far more devastating weapons, as Obi-Wan Kenobi mentioned. The lightsaber rifle, for instance, was absolutely terrifying. But they didn't really fit the ideology of the Order, and they also used the lightsabers as ammunition, and they would destroy them quite frequently. The lightsaber was also a bright beacon for others to see. It was like a standard or flag to follow on the battlefield. The Jedi could inspire other soldiers simply by appearing and waving that thing around. Also, a lightsaber, just like a police siren, is designed to announce the presence of a Jedi. The Jedi wanted to be seen, they wanted to be known, unless they're doing like a stealth mission behind enemy lines, but yeah, generally, they were not trying to hide. Most people know that when a Jedi pulls out their weapon, they intend on using it. So it's not only to announce the presence of the Jedi, but it's also to warn people to get away. Also, a lightsaber is kind of like a police siren. It attracts attention to the Jedi, which is what the Jedi wants. It wants good guys to run to the Jedi for aid, and it wants bad guys to know that the Jedi are here so that they can properly fight them. We all know that a Jedi will never pull out their weapon without the intent of using it. Obviously, announcing your presence before fighting is not the best thing to do, but this is exactly what the lightsaber was all about. It wasn't about giving the Jedi every advantage or opportunity. It was about fitting the Jedi Order's kind of way of life and doing things. And so, what do you guys do if you're on the other side of a lightsaber and facing down a Jedi or even a Sith Lord? Well, you see, a lightsaber actually has many of the same limitations that swords do. Historically speaking, swords only started appearing in large quantities during the Bronze Age. It's a difficult process, shaping metal into a blade. It requires rudimentary knowledge of metal working. Unless you're using a sharp object you found lying around, like, I don't know, a piece of obsidian that could be, fashioned into a dagger or a short sword. But for the most part, early human weapons were not swords. They were instead blunt weapons or polearms, simply because they're easier to build and, more importantly, easier to wield. Back in my hoodlum pizza delivery days, I used to drive around with a tiny miniature baseball bat right next to my leg, and I would have a few baseball bats in the trunk, just in case. Now, I actually had swords too. I was into that kind of stuff back then, but I never brought the swords along with me because I knew it'd be stupid to use one. I'm not a trained fighter. I've never really trained in martial arts. And so a baseball bat seemed to be the easiest weapon for someone as unskilled as me to use. And for most of human history, battles were fought by untrained fools like me. It's simply too expensive to maintain large amounts of professional soldiers. It's much easier to just equip your civilians in times of need. And it can take a lifetime to master handling a sword and understanding how to properly utilize it in combat. And so even during the Iron Age, where swords exploded in popularity, swords still remained an auxiliary weapon, as in a backup weapon. It was always easier and cheaper to build and arm people with spears, which is just basically a wooden stick with a sharp tip at the end. Far less metal and craftsmanship was needed. Spears were also great defensive weapons because of their extended reach. If you have a bunch of levied farmers and shopkeepers, they're not going to be great at breaking through the enemy lines. You'll probably have to rely on your professional shock troopers who are heavily armed and well equipped for those missions. They're also probably training in warfare constantly. Instead, you'll use your levied soldiers in more simple roles, in more defensive and static positions. What you're usually going to do is, group your untrained levied soldiers closer together so that they can support each other from a defensive standpoint, and then give them spears so that they can keep other forces at a distance. Because when people get close, that's when all the dying happens. As a matter of fact, in most battles throughout the history of melee battles here on Earth, most casualties were suffered when formations broke apart, and that's when you start having one-on-one kind of combat and people getting run down from behind. That's what you really want to avoid, and a spear wall is a great way to do that. Now, swords are simply not great defensive weapons. It's incredibly hard to time parries and blocks. This isn't the movies. Most fighters are just blindly swinging and hacking away at other people in real life. And most soldiers who did utilize a sword oftentimes had a shield in their offhand, or they were just heavily armored and used two-handed swords like blunt weapons, smashing their heavily armored opponents to the floor. Historically speaking, many of the best warriors, from the Comanches to the Spartans to the winged hussars, all relied on the simplicity and reach of polearms. I mean, the samurai are famous for their katana, but actually most samurai fought with spear and bow and used their katana as a secondary. Silly Tom Cruise, you can't just use your Scientology magic to rewrite history. The Vikings, who are oftentimes portrayed as big warriors using axes, also use spears and pikes quite a lot. They also use shield wall formations. The only time people really use swords as a primary is the situation we were talking about before, where you have these two-handed great swords that were used during the heavily armored medieval period. And this really has a lot to do with the most simplistic rule in fighting. Whether you're talking about duels between artillery or a fist fight, it's all about range. It's about keeping your enemy at a distance where they can't hit you and you can hit them. And a spear does exactly that. Also, if an individual is using a spear with two hands, not only do they have more range than someone with the sword, they also have more leverage and are able to overpower someone with the sword, especially if they're only holding it with one hand. While there are techniques and ways to defeat a spear or polearm while using a sword, it is common knowledge that swords are going to be inferior in most combat situations. Now, if you take a look at the Star Wars galaxy and you take a closer look at factions that regularly fight Force users, whether it's the Sith or the Jedi, you'll notice that a lot of them use longer range polearms. When the Old Republic launched a counter-invasion of the Sith homeworld of Korriban, Republic soldiers chased the Sith out of their homes and massacred them, usually at the end of an energy pike. As a matter of fact, the old Jedi and Sith conflict that occurred thousands of years before the Clone Wars even started were oftentimes fought with armies with a mixture of troops, as in some Force-sensitive sprinkled in with a bunch of normies. And oftentimes the normies would utilize pikes and spears in order to stand a chance against a Force user wielding a lightsaber. During the legendary Begali Uprising, Sith assassins would arm themselves with Force pikes to hunt down Jedi. And during the Imperial era, the Sith would train weaker Force users to be Inquisitors, whose main job was to hunt down Order 66 Jedi survivors. The tool they were given was a double-bladed lightsaber that could actually spin like a rotor. While not really a polearm, this much longer double-ended blade has much more reach and was usually wielded with two hands, which made it quite formidable against a normal lightsaber. We can also take a look at the Jedi Temple Guardians. Their main job is mainly to protect the temple from outsiders, aka the Jedi's ancient enemy, the lightsaber-wielding Sith. And their secondary job is to make sure that their own members, who also wield lightsabers, stay in line and don't fall to the dark side. And so naturally, the Jedi Guardians' preferred weapon of choice is the Force Pike, which they wield with two hands. It gives them that extra reach and leverage we talk about. And if you take a look at Emperor Palpatine's Royal Guard, you'll find that they're specially trained in martial arts and they also wield Force pikes. Palpatine didn't really fear your normal assassins because he had access to the Force, but he was afraid of the Jedi. And so it makes sense that his own guards would have such a melee weapon in hand. The last weapon you want to use against a Force user is a blaster, and that's because you have as good of a chance hitting them as you do yourself, because they can block the bolts back into your face. Snoke's Praetorian guards were also mostly equipped with longer polearms of different shapes and forms, and they proved to be a challenge for Kylo Ren and Rey to defeat. The more you take a look at Star Wars, the more you see this dynamic between sword and spear. Take Din Djarin and his victory over Moff Gideon. With that Beskar spear, the Mandalorian was able to control the fight and easily knock the darksaber out of Moff Gideon's hands. That same spear was also used by Morgan Elsbeth, and she was able to disarm Ahsoka Tano. Granted, she was dual wielding, but still, that's impressive because Ahsoka is a top-tier fighter and a Jedi warrior, whereas Elsbeth is just a Night Sister. On paper, she wasn't even supposed to stand a chance, but it just goes to show you bringing the right weapon to the battle can mean a lot. And so guys, if you ever do find yourself in the awful situation of having to fight someone who has a lightsaber, grab a stick, a really, really long stick, and try to hold them off for as long as possible and find that opening to run away. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, the democracy.